Hi, um, it's Ken Tune here, and what I'm going to do today is I'm going to show you how to set up a full Aerospike stack, including a Java client and monitoring, from absolute scratch using Ansible. And I'm going to be using the Aerospike Ansible project that I've put together. It's available in the Aerospike Solutions MISC internal repo. You can see the README on the screen here. And the tools that I'm going to show you allow for a lot of flexibility in setting up an Aerospike cluster. So you can choose things like your instance type, the AZs you're going to deploy across, the region you're going to deploy into, the Aerospike version you're going to use, number of hosts per AZ, the number of partitions on your disks, whether or not you're using TLS, whether or not you've got encryption on disk enabled, and a few other things besides. But what I'm going to do in this video is I'm going to show you just the vanilla version, because once you've got that going, you can then do all the other things really easily. And this is going to be a real, top to bottom install, so absolutely no assumptions whatsoever. I'm going to start with a basic virtual box, and I'm going to show you everything that you need to do from there. So on my screen, you will see a list of the commands that I'm going to use, which just helps me avoid tedious typos. I am, of course, going to be using a terminal window, and I'm also going to be using the AWS console. Right, so that's everything in place. Let's get to it. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to make a directory to put my Vagrant box inside. So I'm going to initialize my Vagrant box, Vagrant init, Ubuntu /trusty64, which is a really basic virtual box. Okay, and now I'm just going to bring the box up. And doing it this way just helps you understand, how all the prerequisites work. Okay, and now I'm going to SSH into my box. And the first thing I'm going to do, just to make things a little bit easier to read, is reset the command prompt, because it gets a little long the way it's set up here. Okay, all right. So I'm going to update my apt get list. Make sure everything's up to date on that front. Next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to install pip, which is basically a Python dependency management tool if you haven't used it previously. And then the version that gets installed isn't quite the latest version, so I'm going to use pip to actually bring itself up to date. Okay, so now I've got pip. That's not what I wanted to do. Oh, this is what I wanted to do. So now I've got pip, I'm going to install something called virtualenv. So what virtualenv does, it allows you to create your own personal or project-specific Python environment on your machine, so you don't end up kind of polluting other things that might be happening on your machine by way of installing incompatible libraries, that sort of thing. So that's the purpose of virtualenv. The next thing to do is to install Git, because I will be needing that to pull the repo in. And then, of course, I'm going to clone my Aerospike Solutions MISC repo. I'm doing it via HTTPS, so it's asking me for my username and password. Okay, so that's all good. And now I'm going to cd into the Ansible project. And now I'm going to set up the virtual environment that I talked about. I probably don't need to do this on a virtual box, to be quite honest, but it's the way you should do it on your own machine, so I'm going to do that for you. With virtualenv, you basically provide the name of a directory which will get created, and all the virtual environment configuration gets stored underneath that. So having done that, this is just what you have to do. You have to source the activate file that gets created, and that actually creates the virtual environment for you. And you can see that that's indicated by the addition of the venv prefix to the command line prompt. Okay, so we've got some prerequisites that we have to have in place in order to use Ansible. So we install those using pip. First of all, we need Botto, which is an API which is used by Python to communicate with AWS. You also need Botto 3 actually to use Ansible in full. Okay, and then finally I'm going to install Ansible itself. We're going to need to do some configuration, basically identity configuration, with the AWS command line utility. Basically just set up our credentials so we can get into AWS itself. So I'm going to install the AWS command line utility. So I'm just going to curl this package here, AWS CLI XE, save it using this name. I happen to know that the VirtualBox doesn't actually include the unzip command by default, so I need to install that. And then I'm going to unzip the AWS command line utility install, and I'm going to run the install itself. Okay, there we go. Right, so the next thing I need to do is I need to set up my AWS credentials. I'm going to be using AWS Configure in order to do that, but what I want to show you is the way you set up your AWS credentials on the AWS side. So I go to the AWS console and I go to Identity Management. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to set up a group which will give me the ability to do pretty much whatever I want on EC2. I'm going to call that group Aerospike Ansible. The next step is I have to choose a policy, and I'm going to choose EC2 full access. Okay, and that is pretty much all there is to it. I'm then going to create a user, and that's going to be the user that I will connect with, and I will add it to the Aerospike Ansible group. It's going to be used for programmatic access. Add user to group, add it to the Aerospike Ansible group. I'm not going to tag it. Looks good to me. Create the user. Okay, so the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to access my credentials. Now these credentials only get shown once. After doing this demo, I will be deleting this user, so it doesn't hurt me to show you the credentials, but normally you would look to keep them a secret. So I do know that the AWS Configure utility will be asking me both for my access key ID and my secret access key, so I'll just anticipate that slightly. So there's the access key and the secret access key. And default region, I'm going to select US East-1. Okay, and that's everything done on that front. And then just one last thing. SSH by default will kind of work through all the keys you have when it's trying to connect to a given resource. You can, if you go beyond trying a number of times and failing, SSH will give up. So what I want to force it to do is just use the key that I specify. So this bit of config here is just going to make sure that that happens. Identities only is yes. Basically says only use the identity file that I provide to SSH and for SSH purposes. It's very picky about the permissions on this file, so I'm going to chmod it to basically read write for myself, read for everybody else. Okay. and we are now good to go. So to run an Ansible playbook, it's as simple as this. So Ansible playbooks, if you open them up, they're basically YML inside. If you want to see what is inside here, the code is inside the repository, so you're welcome to do that. So I'm going to do AWS setup plus Aerospike install, and that is just going to do everything. So we can just watch that scroll by. When I say everything, it's going to set up all the VPC assets. It's going to create the Aerospike hosts in the AZs that I specified, the number that I specified. So I'm using all the defaults. So I'm just going to get 3 AZs, 1 host in each. But I can change that if I choose to. It will use Community Edition. The reason for that is that I want this to work out of the box. So if you don't have a beach key file, it obviously won't work out of the box. That's the reason for using Community, that this will work equally well if you're using Enterprise as well. So all we do is we just hit return and we watch things happen. Worth looking at some of the things that are happening on the screen here. So we set up the VPC. Ahead of that, we actually created a key. So every time this runs, it will create a separate SSH kind of key pair, and then it will throw it away. So that's very good from a security point of view. So this is really intended, for benchmarking use or for sort of one-time setup of POCs or demos, what have you. So creating the subnets, the gateway out to the internet, all the routes that you need. And it's now moving on to setting up the instances. So you need to give an instance, you need to specify the subnet that it goes in. You need to specify the AMI that you're going to use. And there's some sort of neat stuff in here whereby it will pick the latest version of the Amazon Linux 2 AMI every time via a search string. So that's something that is configurable. That's in the README. All right, so we've got all the instances spun up, so it's now moving to doing the Aerospike install. It will check to see if there's already Aerospike installed, so we'll try not to repeat work if that turns out to be unnecessary. If you've already done the download, for example, it won't repeat the download. Tells you which version it's going to use, community, latest, EL6 distribution. What are we doing on the configuration side? We've got strong consistency set to false, TLS set to false, encryption at rest set to false. It will partition the disks for you, so 4 partitions per device by default. So you're seeing some stuff in blue which is being skipped because I'm not using TLS. That's all certificate related, but that would get actioned if I set TLS enabled to true. The next section that we're moving on to here is it will install the Prometheus monitoring agent as well. So it puts the prerequisites in for that. Does the build. Okay, so that's everything. That's our 3-node cluster set up. So now we're going to log into one of the cluster boxes. So one of the things that the scripts give you is some handy utility scripts that enable you to sort of get in and out of the boxes without having to copy and paste IP addresses around. So I'm going to do scripts cluster quick SSH, and I supply an index. So if there's 3 nodes in the cluster, I can provide a number between 1 and 3. I'm just going to log into the first one, check everything looks good. Got 3 nodes online. AQL, insert into test. That's my default namespace. PK values 1. Okay, and it's all good. So the next thing I'm going to do is set up a Java benchmarking client, and I just do Ansible playbook again and Aerospike Java client setup, and that will once again go away and do its stuff. So this time I get a certain amount of information concerning the AWS environment, VPC ID, subnet ID. By default, the client will be put in the first AZ that you specify. You can change that if you want. You can set up more than one client if you want. Okay, so the instance has been created. I get a utility script the same way I get it with the cluster node, so I can log into the client using scripts /client quick ssh.sh. We'll see me using that a little bit later on. And the nice thing is it just sets up all the benchmarking stuff for you. So it downloads Aerospike client Java, and it compiles it, and it copies over some sort of utility scripts and sets up the IP addresses and all that sort of thing. So it's doing all the Java Git, systat, Maven, screen install stuff. The sort of stuff that frankly does tend to take quite a lot of time if you do it by hand. So these are utility scripts, benchmarking utility scripts being copied over now. Alright, and let's just check that all is well. So I'm going to log into the client machine. So I've got Aerospike client Java, benchmarks directory. So I've got some utility scripts, one that will just do writes and one that will do read writes. And they share certain common properties which are stored in AS benchmark common. So for instance, the host you can see has already been set, the namespace. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to set it up so it creates 10 million keys for us while I'm using the Ansible scripts to create the monitoring assets. So first I'm going to change the standard rate, because it's a little bit on the slow side. I'm going to change this to 5,000. Okay, I'm going to put this inside a screen so that when I log out, it just keeps going. Okay, then I'm just going to do AS benchmark write only, and off it goes. And I just say, just kind of look at that. I've just set all this stuff up. I haven't really configured anything at all. And it is just ready to go, which is really, a major time saver. So let's park that thought. I'm going to log out of the screen now, and I'm going to log out of the instance as well. And then I'm going to proceed to the final part of the stack setup, which is just the setting up of the monitoring related assets. And you'll see some familiar things going on. In fact, the scripts are actually kind of common, across the stack in terms of setting up the instances for monitoring, setting up the instances for the client. It's actually running the same playbooks, so these messages are exactly the same as before. I'll get a utility script so I can log into the monitoring instance if I want to. They're probably not necessary. As I said, upon that, you're going to have both Prometheus and Grafana, because that's what we need in terms of our monitoring stack. Kind of useful, just to notice that there's quite a lot of wiring has gone in here. So the agents that gather information from Aerospike for Prometheus, they've already been installed and they're already up and running. And then the configuration on the Prometheus side, that's going to be taken care of by the scripts. And then the connection of Grafana to Prometheus and the loading of our dashboards, that's all happening in the background. Okay, so that is the whole shooting match. And just look, we get a URL at the bottom here. It shows us how to connect to Grafana. If we should forget for any reason, then there's actually a script that has all this information in as well. So you can just run scripts monitoring IP address list. And the same is true actually for the cluster IPs or the client IPs in case you need those, and they put those are put in sort of convenient environment variables, so you can read the documentation if you want to know more about that. Okay, so Grafana is now sitting on port 4000. So we're opening up Grafana for the first time. The access credentials to start off with are admin, and you will be invited to secure those. Always a good idea, because unsecured ports on the internet are not a good idea. Okay, welcome to Grafana. Let's find our dashboards. They're in the Aerospike directory. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take a look at the cluster overview. So this gives us some, sort of familiar-ish information. There's my cluster name. You can see I'm running version 5004, which was the latest version at the time I recorded this demo. At the time of recording this demo, the cluster size is 3. And now I'm going to use a dashboard that I prepared for the Summit demo, just because it helps me sort of show you the information that I'd like you to see. So in particular, the client activity that we launched a few minutes ago, what that was doing was it was writing 10 million keys into the database. You'll see there's 10 million one here. So the one, if you remember, is the one that I inserted just when I did a little test, just when I set the cluster up. Just vanishing off the edge there, there was a little bit of activity. So that's basically the activity from the writes that we launched earlier. Okay, so the last thing really that remains for me to do is really just to show you this in action. So I'm going to go back to the Aerospike client. So I'm going to do scripts and log in to the client. So it's the client quick SSH there. I'm going to go back to my screen. Okay, and I'm going to launch some read-write activity. So all I need to do is just type this, and that will basically set off. So the rate has been configured to be 5000 TPS there. So it should kind of adjust to 2000, 2500, both read and write after a little while. And before too long, we should see that coming through on the dashboard. So you can just see that beginning to ramp up there. The dashboard will refresh every 10 seconds by default. So let's just wait for that to happen. I can hasten that by actually doing the refresh. So you will you will notice this taking just a small amount of time to stabilize. Amongst other things, the agents on the cluster lag ever so slightly what you would see in the screen. So that's the main reason for that. So really, that's everything that I wanted to show you today. I just want to draw your attention to the fact that fundamentally all we've done is just run 3 scripts, right? So there was a certain amount of preamble. So I wanted to show you, the business of setting up a virtual environment, the business of installing Ansible, because as you can see, there's just kind of 1 or 2 things that you need to get right the first time. But once you've got those right, you can use those things in perpetuity. Another thing, to note is that I also showed you the IAM setup. Again, it's the sort of thing that could get in your way the first time, but once you've got it set up, you never have to think about it again. But after that, we just ran 3 scripts. We built the cluster, we built the client, we built the monitoring framework. We didn't enter a single IP address. We didn't do any configuration whatsoever, and you just get this, which is working at the end of it all. And the scripts are highly configurable. So obviously there is an out-of-the-box configuration, but you can adjust that. So you can obviously run community or enterprise. You can choose the AZs that you use. You can choose how many hosts you have in each AZ. You can choose things like the AWS region. You can choose whether or not you use TLS. You can choose whether or not you have encryption on disk. So it's really got a lot of flexibility. Okay, and then the very last thing, really, you're kind of happy, you've done whatever it is you want to do. How do you get rid of it all? Well, really quite straightforward. So I'm going to exit out of this screen here. I'm going to exit from the client, and then all I need to do is I just need to run Ansible playbook AWS teardown. And this is just going to take everything down. It's going to start with all the hosts, and then it's going to take all the AWS assets down. And then finally, it will even remove the SSH key that's been used to access the cluster. All right, so it's removed the hosts. And now we're just taking all the VPC stuff down. Root table, subnets. You'll see some errors in the background because the Grafana instance, that's just disappeared. So the browser's trying to contact some things which just aren't there. But yeah, that's everything. So even the SSH key that's used to access the hosts, that gets removed as well. So thank you for watching. I hope you find the tool useful.